Good morning and welcome to the Center for European Studies Friday Lecture Series. Today is October 4th, 2013. My name is Rachel Silas.
My name is Lucy Ansla.
And we're members of the class of 2015 Transatlantic Master's Program here at UNC. Today it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor A. Maurits van der Veen. Professor van der Veen is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and he's taught there since 2010. He received his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in 1989, followed by an MS in computer science from Stanford University in 1992. In 2000, Dr. van der Veen received a PhD in government from Harvard University. He has held positions at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Research Center on European Integration, ARENA, in Oslo, Norway, and at the University of Georgia. In 2011, he published a book entitled Ideas, Interests, and Foreign Aid. In addition, he's authored numerous articles and book chapters.
Maurits van der Veen's research interests are located in the section of international relations and comparative politics. He's also interested in ideas and identity in foreign policy, in European integration, in identity politics in Western Europe, as well as in human rights and humanitarianism. He's also interested in various ways policymakers frame a certain policy issue and the impact those frames have on actual policy choices. He applied this approach on Western Europe's and US foreign policies and on the politics of EU integration. He is also interested in agent-based computational models that are models to analyze impacts of social networks on the spread of policy frames or ideas. Today, Maurits van der Veen is going to talk about national meanings of European integration. What do European publics see in the EU? So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to come talk. So, title of my talk is National Meanings of European Integration, and the basic idea is, move this back just a little bit. Basic idea is that we know, if you talk to anyone who's worked in European integration, they will tell you something along the lines of, well, you know, the French look at the EU differently than the British or than the Germans, and usually it just sort of stays there. And I want to see if we can somehow get beyond the just sort of, there's a Britishness and there's a Germanness, and we just sort of throw up our hands and don't try to explain it any further. So that's sort of the motivation behind this paper. So I have, this is sort of a longer quotation saying what I just said. It's from a book by Commissioner Bolkestein, well, former EU Commissioner Bolkestein. He wrote a book in 2004 called The Limits of Europe. And he basically says, look, every country sees the EU from a different perspective. He gives his examples of France. It's a matter of furthering French ambitions. For Germany, it's the Zweite Heimat, and so on and so forth, right? At least he is, in that sense, I think, better than many people who will sort of say it matters where you are from because that determines how you think, in that he tries to give some content to the different ways of thinking. Right? David Cameron, British Prime Minister, in a speech in which he promised the British that they would get a referendum to vote on whether or not to stay in the EU or not, essentially just said, we have the character of an island nation. Right? So what does that mean? It's just sort of a cop-out in a way, I think. And so the challenge, if you want to study European integration, and you agree that there are these different ways of thinking about the EU, the challenge is to somehow make this comparable. So you don't just have to say there's some ineffable Britishness and there's some ineffable Frenchness, and we're going to pretend that that's just in a black box and we don't care. The challenge is to figure out how can we compare and maybe give content to these different things. And so that's really what I'm trying to do. So my argument is going to be that in fact national ways of thinking about European integration are sort of essentially a smallish set of similar building blocks, so that it's not some completely unidentifiable Britishness, but rather the British are more likely to think of the EU in ways A, B, and C, and the French are more likely to think about the EU in ways D, E, and F. So Now you might think that if you have these building blocks, that fundamentally they're all going to just reduce down to, are you for or against the EU, and perhaps are you left-wing or right-wing, right? Those are sort of the common dimensions of contestation within the EU, and it's not unreasonable to think that somehow this would all reduce down. So the Britishness of thinking about the EU would just be they're comparatively conservative and they're comparatively against the EU, right? My argument's going to be that, in fact, it doesn't reduce nicely to these broad underlying things. They're really separate components of how you think about the EU. And then the third part of my argument is it's not just an incredibly broad spectrum of ways of thinking about the EU that when you average them across a whole country, it looks like you have a country picture. But if you took, any random person, how they thought about the EU wouldn't look at all like the average, but rather, in fact, most people look like the average, so to speak. They're sort of widely shared. All right, so the talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about theory. There isn't really an enormous amount of theory here. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data that I'm using to sort of test my argument. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about aggregate patterns, and then I'll dive right into, can we identify national patterns, national ways of thinking about the EU? All right, so very little bit of theory. Why should we expect common building blocks in this sort of national way of looking at the EU? Well, at the sort of at the simplest level, it's just there's only so many different ways you can think about the EU, right? So you should be able to break it down into building blocks. Also, more empirically, people have looked at this. People have sort of tried to say, let us try to give content. What does it mean when a British person talks about the EU? What do they think about? What do they see in the EU? People have tried to look at this comparatively. Not very many people, but some people have. There's a very good book by Diaz Medrano called Framing Europe, in which he does this in Britain, Germany, and Spain. And he finds, and other people have found, that there are sort of a fairly limited set of things you can associate with the EU. So that's why there's reason for there to be common building blocks. And then, of course, countries argue and bargain with one another in the EU context, and that's going to have some effect. You sort of, if your Britishness and your Frenchness were completely incompatible, then you wouldn't be able to do any bargaining or compromising or anything. And so the fact that they are bargaining and compromising suggests also that they're the same building blocks. Theoretically, why should we expect that this is not really just building blocks that can be reduced to broad underlying dimensions like for or against integration or left or right-wing politics? Well, if it were, then people wouldn't keep talking decade after decade about a particular French way or a particular British way of looking at the EU, right? If it really were that easy to reduce, then scholars and politicians would have long since figured out that Britishness just means opposition to the EU and perhaps maybe comparative to some European countries like the right of center. The fact that people haven't, I think, is strong suggestion that it in fact doesn't reduce to these simple dimensions. And then finally, why should we expect there really to be a nationally identifiable way of thinking about the EU? And here the argument comes more out of sociology. Basically, we sort of know that generally how people frame issues, how people think about the world is very much informed by sort of shared national culture and identity in the way that gets reproduced in national discourses in the media and the like. So to the extent that everyone exposed to the same media grows up, going through the same educational curriculum, people should, we think, have sort of similar ideas, similar ways of looking at these things. Right, so in the paper I have 6 hypotheses. I'm not going to run through them here one by one because we'll sort of cover them as we go along through the presentation, but they're all fairly straightforward. None of this is particularly intellectually challenging by way of deriving a hypothesis. So a little bit on the data. It would be nice if we had data that sort of said, when people, what would you think if you're a British person, what do you see as the British way of thinking about the EU? We don't have data like that. We have something that is useful, not great, but useful, which is that the Eurobarometer survey, starting in 2002, have been asking a question where they ask respondents, what does the EU mean to you personally? That's actually a pretty good, useful, interesting question. Unfortunately, as is often the case with these surveys, they then go on and sort of undermine it by giving a really flawed set of possible responses, right? So rather than actually being able to say what the EU means to you, you have to choose from a set list of 14 possible responses, some of which are positive, some which are negative. It's not clear who selected this set list. They're not implausible possible things, but they certainly don't exhaust the spectrum of possibilities. So it's sort of like, if you imagine there's a bunch of different building blocks that could make the national way of thinking about the EU. The Eurobarometer survey people randomly picked out 14 people from this much bigger set. And then you just have to be lucky that those are the 14 building blocks that are going to give you some useful leverage to distinguish national patterns. As it turns out, and I will show, they do give you useful leverage, but it would be a lot nicer if there were more possible answers. The other problem with the question, and it'll have a minor implication a little bit later in the talk, is that you basically can only say yes or no to any of these possible things the EU could mean to you. Right? They say, what does the EU mean to you personally? And then they say, peace. And you can't say, yeah, sort of vaguely. You either have to say yes or no. Right? So it's all binary. This is a problem if you're thinking about national patterns of how people think about the EU, right? Because basically, it's unlikely that everyone in a country associates the EU with peace, right? It's more likely that most people do, or most people sort of vaguely associate it with peace. So you get some sort of, the national meaning of the EU is an average, right? It's somewhere between 0 and 1, which means that any individual person is never going to be precisely fit the national pattern, because individual people cannot give an answer between 0 and 1. They have to say either 0 or 1. All right, so this question has been asked 19 times as of the end of 2012. My data run through the end of 2012. I don't think the first half of 2013 Eurobarometer is available yet. And putting all that data together, you have quite a lot of observations. More than 500,000 people have been interviewed in those surveys. And here are some overall patterns. So these are the 14 different things that the EU is allowed to mean to you in the context of this survey. It's pretty clear that peace and prosperity are positive, waste of money and loss of identity are negative, right? Euro might be neutral, depending a little bit on your position relative to the euro. So a couple of things worth noting. One, by far the most popular one always is personal mobility, the ability to travel, work, and live throughout the European Union is really the most prominent across all member states thing that people associate with the EU. Peace is pretty prominent, but much less so. Economic prosperity, not so much, right? Roughly 1 in 5 people. These are overall percentages. Roughly 1 in 5 people says so. The other thing you can sort of look at here is that I've broken down the EU membership, right? So there's the original 6 member states, the 15 North and West European member states prior to the 2004 enlargement, the 10 Central and East European countries, and then the complete EU 27. And you can see that there are, in fact, clear differences between, let's say, the EU 15 and the East European countries, right? So, for example, more than a quarter of the EU 15 thinks that global influence is something they associate with the EU, and less than 20% of East Europeans do. So there's already some indication that there's some variation. You can see the variation even better if you look at just a single survey. So this is randomly chosen single survey from spring of 2007. The first column here is similar to the columns on the previous slide. And then the second column shows basically at the country level of the 27 EU member states at the time, what was the lowest percentage that in any given country associated a certain thing with the EU, right? And so here you see between these two columns, not going to talk about that. Between these two columns, there's often a big range, right? So some country, I don't know how much, only 4% of the people associate the EU with bureaucracy, and in some other country, almost half. Right? So that's a pretty big range. All right, so there's a range across countries. There are very few meanings of the EU that get an enormously strong support, right? The highest is personal mobility, and it rarely goes much above 55% or so. So much of the action is in the middle of the range. That might be a challenge for trying to separate out countries, as we'll see in a second. First, briefly testing, are these things reducible to underlying dimension of for or against integration, or maybe left-right, or some other sort of broad underlying dimension? The quick answer is no. For this, what you want to pay attention to here, this is a factor analysis. And with the factor analysis, what you get in the right-hand column, these are two separate factor analyses. What you get in the right-hand column is essentially a measure of how much of what goes on in that particular variable, that particular meaning, how much of this is not explained by the factors, right? Then you will see that that's an enormously high number. It averages about 80%, and it's never lower than 70%. So when you're trying to reduce what the EU means to people to big underlying factors, you basically lose more than 2/3 of essentially what the EU means to them, right? Most of what the EU means to them is not reducible to underlying factors. So that's, that was the first hypothesis to be tested. All right, so then if it really is the case that there is a French way of looking at the EU and there is a British way of looking at the EU, then it should be the case that the British way of looking at the EU in 2002 is not that different from the British way of looking at the EU in 2012, right? Otherwise, it's more like there's a 2002 way of looking at the EU and there's a 2012 way. And in fact, of course, there's a little bit of that latter in there, right? 2012, many more people are very skeptical about the EU, right? And the Euro crisis and so on and so forth, people are very skeptical. 2002, they were much more positive. So what this chart shows you is in the entire range, in the 19 surveys that were asked over a period of 10 years, what's the lowest percentage in country X that answered this particular meaning, and what's the highest percentage? And then the countries are sorted from left to right. And so what you see here is that most countries have a pretty narrow range, right? They don't fluctuate wildly over the entire possible spectrum. In fact, that range from sort of whatever survey they were least likely to associate the EU with peace and whatever survey they were most likely to associate with peace, that range on average is about 20% over time, but it remains fairly compact. And what that allows you to do is you can already begin to say, okay, there's ways to separate countries, right? If so Spain, even in the year where they were most likely to associate the EU with peace, didn't get up above 25%, whereas there's a couple of countries here on the left that never fall below 30%. Right? So on the dimension of peace, if I gave you a national average, you would already be able to tell, is this Sweden or Spain, right? Because they never overlap. You can do a chart like this for each of these 14 possible different meanings, and if you want to look at any particular ones, I have them all as extra slides at the back, but they all basically look the same. All right, so then on to actually getting to trying to distinguish countries from one another. One thing you can do with these charts is say, okay, well, are there countries that are disproportionately likely to be over on the left, where they really strongly associate the EU with things, and are there countries that are disproportionately over on the right, where they don't tend to associate the EU strongly with anything? As a general pattern, East European countries are more on the right. They don't have very strong associations for the EU, or not nearly as strong as West European countries. And then there are some smaller patterns, right? So you might think, if you sort of follow the pundit level literature on the EU, that the British are going to just be way on the top in terms of all the negative things they associate with the EU. This is not true. At least it's not true for the particular set of negative things that they can answer here. What's interesting, I think, is that the Nordic populations, which we tend to think of as being rather ambivalent, actually stand out in that they're both likely to associate positive things with the EU and likely to associate negative things with the EU, right? So that's sort of a way, it sort of is in accordance with the idea that they're ambivalent. There's things they like a lot about the EU, and there's things that they don't like a lot or dislike a lot. All right, so countries sort of stand out a little bit. Over time, the averages remain relatively constant, but there's still a considerable amount of overlap, right? So now we get to the meat of the exercise. Can we figure out what the country is if all we know is essentially, in a given survey, what percentage of the population answered yes to a particular meaning? So how would you try to do that? Well, I'm just going to run quickly through a little example with the Benelux, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So this isn't the colors don't show up quite as nicely here. But so take just two of these meanings of the EU, right? Economic prosperity and bureaucracy, and you can plot each of the survey averages for each country, and then you can see if you can separate them. Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg are obviously very close together. One would expect them to be hard to separate. It turns out that with this particular combination of meanings, you can actually split off the Dutch, who are in blue, from the Belgians, who are in black. It's clear that it would be pretty hard, i.e. impossible in this case, to split off the Belgians from the Luxembourg people, right? They're completely intermeshed. So if I gave you sort of on bureaucracy, if I said, in this country, 15% of the people associate the EU with bureaucracy, can you tell me what country it is? I could say, well, I know it's not the Netherlands, right? But I have no idea whether it's Luxembourg or Belgium. Now you could add a dimension, right? Because we have 14 of these different meanings. So in theory, you can go into 14 dimensions. And you can see that if you add a dimension, there's bureaucracy and prosperity again. And then we add peace. You can sort of see that in 3 dimensions, to the extent that you can see the mapping, it looks as though Belgium and Luxembourg are going to be easier to separate, right? So you might say, okay, well, then we add a 4th. By then, it might be possible to, in fact, separate Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg from one another, right? Now, of course, it's not obvious that those same 3 or 4, I didn't pick these completely randomly, it's not obvious that those same 3 or 4 that might allow you to separate Belgium from the Netherlands and Luxembourg would also allow you to separate any of those countries from Germany, let's say, right? So what we would really like to do is to basically let a computer try to figure this out for us, rather than sort of play with this by hand and draw lines and plot our little 3-dimensional things. And so basically what we want to do is we want to figure out, can we draw a line in 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 14 dimensions? Hyperplanes, they become in 14 dimensions. Can we draw a line or a plane that separates countries from other countries, any pair of countries from one another? And so it turns out that there's an enormous literature on trying to do exactly this in machine learning, because it's a way to classify things, any things. In our particular case, it's countries. And so that's the method is called support vector machines. To my knowledge, no one in political science has used support vector machines except a very small number of people who have used them to try and classify texts. So classify someone, if you read, I think there is one paper published on tweets, right? Are your tweets about Obama positive or negative? You can use this approach to try and figure that out. But the approach actually comes out of statistical machine learning, and it actually comes out of a puzzle that's much more like the puzzle that we have here, which is, can you separate these two groups of points, basically? Can you separate 2 groups of points with a line? And if so, which line should you pick if you want to have sort of the best line to separate them? And so what the support vector machine algorithm does is it says, all right, here we have 2 groups of points. in our case. These are points, again, Netherlands and Luxembourg on prosperity and social protection case. And you can see that the two groups are separable with a line, right? In fact, they are separable with an infinite number of lines, pretty much anywhere between this one and that one. And so what the support vector machine algorithm does is it says, I'm going to declare, and that's what the algorithm does, that the best line is the one that maximizes this sort of the width of the band that separates them. Right? And so if you go back to the previous slide, with this line, the width of the band that separates them is essentially 0, right? Because it touches right there and it touches right there. Why is this a good idea to declare that the best line is the one that has the biggest band separating them? Well, the idea is that what we're doing here is we're not trying to explain specifically the points that we have found, right? We're not trying to explain specifically the British in 2007. We're interested in figuring out, is there a way that we can characterize the British? Right? And if we did a line like this, then let's stick with the Netherlands and Luxembourg for a minute. If you did a line like this, and it turns out, let's say we pick this line, right? And then in 2013, the Dutch dot is going to be here. That's not that unlikely. It's not completely out of its cluster, but it would be on the wrong side of the line. Right? So what we're interested in is future data. What maximizes the likelihood that we will also be able to correctly classify future data? And it turns out that this algorithm, maximizing that band, is the best way to do it. So, can you in fact identify each of those national points, national averages in a given survey, given the 14 dimensions we have at our disposal? Yes, you can. You only actually need 7. Right? So, if you pick the right 7 meanings of European integration, of the European Union, you can take any national point from any of the 19 surveys over a period of 12 years, and you can correctly classify it. That already is, I think, impressive and perhaps surprising, right? Because it shows you that despite the fact that in 2004 the EU is doing great, in 2012 there's a terrible crisis, all kinds of other things happen along the way, nonetheless, over the entire range of time, a national average on this question, which asks you nothing actually about are you rich or are you poor, or what industry do you work in, and nothing sort of about your physical characteristics. It only asks how do you think about the EU. That data is enough to let you know what country you're from at the national aggregate level. Right? So that really suggests strongly that there is something like a national meaning, right? And it's one that we can characterize now. Because this data basically allows us to do that. All right. The problem with what I've just told you is, of course, that you risk running into the problem that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is it might be that if we use these 7 meanings, then we won't be able to correctly classify anything, any country point from the 2013 survey. And that would be pretty weak. Right? So that would be pretty disappointing. So what they usually do in the machine learning communities, they say, to avoid this problem, we will just take only part of the data to learn, to try and predict, to learn how to predict what country you're from, and then we'll use the rest to test how well we learned. Right? You can do this here. Normally in machine learning, they sort of randomly pick a subset of the data, and then they test it on another random subset. But what's actually much more interesting from our point of view is to say, let us take these national points from the pre-crisis surveys, right? So up through 2007, that's less than half of the total data we have, and see how well, based on the national patterns that we learned there, we can predict what country is associated with what point in the crisis years. And it turns out you can do very well, right? So learning from how national samples in Eurobarometer think about the EU in the pre-crisis era, and then trying to use what you've learned to predict what country is this when I tell you 70% associate the EU with peace and 30% associated with bureaucracy, you can correctly classify more than 3/4 of these national aggregate points. And 10 of the countries you can get classified correctly all the time, right? Those are the ones with the strongest the most consistency over time. So this is in the paper. You can't see it very well here. This is obviously a map of the EU. Darker countries are classified correctly more often. So Finland, Sweden, UK are classified correctly all the time, so is Portugal. And then the lighter the country is, the more mistakes there are made, basically. The computer sort of says, I think this is Austria, and really it's Germany, right? And so what the text shows here is how many times does the computer mispredict or misclassify a country, and what's the most likely country to mispredict as. So you can see that Estonia gets mispredicted a fair bit, but it gets mispredicted as being Latvia, which is its neighbor, right? So that's not that bad an error. It shows, which I think is also important in sort of the study of what is the national meaning of the EU, it strongly suggests that these national meanings aren't completely idiosyncratic, that they have things in common, especially with neighboring countries, right? So Germany is most likely to be misclassified as Austria, as is the Czech Republic, as is Slovakia, right? So they're all close to each other, and there's clearly a certain amount of sharedness there. Spain is most likely to be misclassified as Portugal, as is Italy, which is obviously not super close, but it is similar in that it's Mediterranean. So there's already a suggestion here that there's some of these national ways of thinking about the EU spread across borders. Okay, so what you might say, and this gets to the issue of how shared are these national ways of thinking about it. You might say, okay, well, yes, but you are only able to do this because you have a 1,000-person sample, right? So imagine that there's a lot of variation. Once you've taken 1,000 people, a lot of that variation gets dampened out. So it might be the case that there's in fact no British way of thinking about the EU. There's 10 British ways of thinking about the EU. And they average out to something that looks like it might be a British way of thinking about the EU, except that if you sort of looked at smaller samples, they wouldn't look anything like that global average. My hypothesis, based sort of on the sociology of how this works, is that that possibility is not correct, right? My hypothesis is that if you take a much smaller group, you will still get the same kind of ability to predict. So the way to test that is basically to sort of randomly pick subsamples. So what I did is I took each of these national surveys, each of these national samples in a survey. So let's say the 2007 survey that I showed you the data for, and I said, okay, they pulled 1,000 Germans. So randomly divide that group of 1,000 Germans into 33 groups of 30 Germans each, right? Randomly assign them to groups. And do the same with every other country. So now we have much, much smaller country groups. So if it is the case that there are really 10 different ways for Germans to think about the EU, then if you get a much smaller group, it's much more likely you randomly get everyone from one of those 10, and it doesn't look anything like the overall average. In fact, it turns out that when you take a subsample size of 30, you can correctly predict more than 3/4 of the time what country that group is from, right? So I tell you, here's a random group of 30 people from the same country in the same year, right? So a random group of 30 people, they're all from the same country, and they're all polled in the same year. And this is what the EU means to them. What country are they from? And you can, more than 3/4 of the time, you can correctly predict where they're from. As the group gets smaller, of course, it gets harder and harder, right? Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, individuals can only say yes or no. They're not averages, right? And so to the extent that the national pattern is sort of a halfway in between average, a smaller set is much more likely to get you away from that national average. So as you would expect, as the size of the group gets smaller, your percentage correctly predicting gets worse. But even with a group as small as 20, you're still at basically 2/3 of the time correctly predicting. Now this So you think of this isn't really the same as R squared, right? But think of this as sort of comparing to statistical models of, let me try to do a statistical model of citizenship in the EU. Oftentimes people are happy with, like, R squares or correctly predicting things only 30-40%, right? Because there's so much variation. Here we get really high correct prediction of what country you're from, with just a group size of 20. When you go down to 10, it gets considerably worse. You're less than half of the time it's correct, but still, in the grand scheme of things, that's not so bad. It turns out that the British are most similar to one another, right? There's the least variation, and so they're most easily correctly classified. So even when you have a group of 10 random people, if they are British, then the computer more than 2/3 of the time correctly identifies them as being British. All right, so this again is a map basically with the same setup as the previous map I showed. So darker countries, smaller groups are easier to classify. So Britain is the darkest country here, right? Italians are pretty hard to classify. Most of the East Europeans are fairly hard to classify. Nordic countries are pretty easy again. All right, so final test is, what if rather than taking 10 random or 20 random, 30 random people from the national sample, you limit them to being from a particular region? Right, so what if it is the case that in fact Scots have nothing at all in common with the Welsh in terms of how they think about the EU? Then now you would essentially start failing, right? If you sort of said, let us pick only Scottish people. Also, if it is true that there is a certain sharedness across borders, what you would expect to see is that border regions are more likely to be mispredicted as being from the neighboring country. Right? So both of those are things we can test by breaking it down to the regional level. And the Eurobarometer has, fortunately, data about what region a person was interviewed in. In most countries, this is the European Union has this nomenclature of unified nomenclature of territorial regions, basically a way to be consistent about regions. Most of them are at the NUTS 2 level. Germany and the UK are big enough that they do things at the NUTS 1 level, but you can basically pick subgroups from these identifiable regions, right? So as I did with the others, you test on a subset, and then you train on a subset, and you test on the rest. And as you can see here in the breakdown, this is actually pretty good, right? It's not really all that much worse than picking people randomly from across the entire country. So here we have, I'm using 30-person groups, right? So if you look at the 30-person groups randomly picked from across the entire country, you get about 3/4 correct. If you take 30-person groups randomly picked from within a specific region, you still get more than 2/3 correct, right? So a smaller number, as you would expect, right? You expect there to be a certain amount of regional variation in how people look at the EU, but not that much smaller, right? Suggesting that really, even though regions differ a little bit, there is actually a pretty strong national sort of conformity pressure in a way on how you think about the EU. So still correct to correctly predict more than 2/3. Sweden is very easy to predict, not much regional variation in Sweden. Italy is very hard to predict, a lot of regional variation in Italy. Neither of those is really particularly surprising. Here, this is probably the hardest to see map. So these are the regions, with the black line being country borders, and then the white lines being region borders. One of the things worth noting, I sort of say this in the paper, is that it seems to be the case that sort of historically core regions are easier to identify than historical outliers. So, like in Spain, Castile and Leon is easier. That's just sort of a small thing. The last remaining thing to test here is, as I suggested, if it is true that there are patterns in these meanings that go across borders, then if you are mispredicting where a group is from, you should be more likely to mispredict them as being from the country right next door, especially if you're in a border region. And so that is true, right? So what these numbers essentially tell you is that if you are mispredicting any region, the country to which any region belongs, you are more likely to mispredict that they're from a neighboring country. That's the bottom piece here. So neighbors are more likely to be guessed in non-border regions at about 42%. But if you are actually in the border region, then that goes up, right? So that effect, the sort of similarity to your neighboring country, is stronger at the border than it is in the center of the country, so to speak. And so that strongly suggests that there is a certain amount of diffusion across national borders in these national meanings of European integration. So that was basically it. A quick recap. So we have these support vector machines, which is a very handy tool that pretty much hasn't been used yet in political science, but I think has a lot of promise. And I use them here to show that there really is such a thing as a national meaning of the EU, that these are pretty constant over time, that you can use them with remarkable accuracy to predict where pretty small groups of Europeans are from, based solely on their answer to the question, what does the EU mean to you? And that that regions pretty much look similar on the whole to the national, the overall national average, but they are influenced by the neighboring countries. So all of this, I think, has significant implications for sort of how we think about issues of national identity and national meanings of the EU and so on, which most of the time in the study of European integration, people tend to just black box, right? If you ever, sort of more often than not, if you read any statistical analysis of European integration, there'll be country dummies at the bottom, right? Or just like, stuff happens at the national level, let's just ignore it, we put country dummies in, we're done with it. This is a way to basically break open these country dummies. And so in that respect, I think has a lot of promise. So I will stop there and happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
I have one question just about the demographics. Did they try to reuse the same people? I mean, to sort of get a consistent...
No, they don't.
Okay.
No, so panel data would be nice, but on this particular question, we don't have panel data information.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. I was really interested in what you had to say about how regions that were bordering other countries showed similarities with one another. And I'm curious if you looked at all at regions that bordered non-EU countries and whether they differed.
I have not, but that's a very good idea. So what would be interesting, so the problem is then for you to be able to say anything about whether they're being impacted by what's going on outside the EU, you'd have to have a sense of what people outside the EU think, right? And so for some non-EU bordering countries, that's hard. It turns out actually that there are some non-EU countries that border the EU that are included in these surveys. And I have basically stripped them out here, so I'm looking only at the EU member states. But it would be interesting to look at so for example, Croatia is in most of these surveys before it joined the EU. And it would be interesting to see whether Croatia is basically, importing the way it looks at the EU from Slovenia, its neighbor, or whether Croatia is really different and somehow rubbing off on Slovenia, which is, exposed to a non-EU neighbor. I don't really know offhand. It's an interesting thing to look at.
Thank you. When you look at these sets of data over time, do you see a convergence among several countries of identity on the EU?
No. What you see, there's the chart in the paper that I didn't show you here, where I tried to do the factor analysis, and it doesn't really give you that much leverage because most of these things are separate. But what you see with the factor analysis is that everyone sort of moves in the same direction, right? So that once the crisis hit, sort of everyone systematically starts being less likely to associate economic prosperity with the EU. So they sort of move as a group, but there is not much evidence that the group gets smaller, so to speak.
So this is sort of the policy question, but so if you're in Brussels right now, having given this talk to some of those Brussels European Commission people who really love the EU, which is not all of them, mind you. We know that in part from Professor Hoog's work, that they're actually a varied lot. But let's just imagine we have these the sorts of people who really believe in deepening the European Union. So what would be your policy recommendations based on your research for helping to create it doesn't need to be a unified kind of love of the EU. They don't all need to like the EU for the same reasons, but a kind of growing support for the EU.
Right. Well, so I think one of the big things that flows out of this, that is at odds with what the EU has been trying to do, is that the EU is trying, or has been trying for a long time, to just sort of give everyone the same message, right? And so if you tell everyone, look at the great things the EU has done in terms of protecting the peace, then in a country where most people, when they think of the EU, think of peace, that may reinforce, things. But even in a country where for most people, peace has nothing at all to do with the EU, then that's basically a useless kind of thing to tell them, right? They'll say, well, whatever. If you say so, okay, but it does nothing for how I think about the EU. So I think what this data shows is that if you're interested in trying to get people to be more supportive of the EU, or to sort of more systematically think the EU is legitimate, you may need to tailor your message to the particular way that people in a given country tend to think about the EU. Right? So countries where they think about the EU in terms of peace, then a message about how great the EU is in terms of peace would be useful, right? But in a country where they don't, not so much. One of the things I mentioned in the paper is that in an ideal world, if you're sort of thinking about the complete set of building blocks that might go into constructing a national meaning of the EU, what you would actually like for a number of these issues is, some people think the EU is really good for peace and some people think it's bad for peace, right? So both of those could be associating the EU with peace as a dimension maybe, but in opposite directions. And this question doesn't give you any leverage on that, right? Peace is maybe not the best example. Economic prosperity, right? So there are certainly people who associate the EU with economic prosperity. There's also people who associate the EU, certainly now, with economic problems. But those are sort of opposite ends on the same dimension. But the survey question just says, prosperity. If you had sort of opposite ends of the same dimension, then you would even much more better be able to sort of target things at particular countries, right? You could sort of say if a lot of people associate the EU with economic difficulties in country X, but not with problems with peace, then maybe you want to sell them more on how the EU helps you economically. But we don't, unfortunately, that's data we don't have.
Right, but I guess you can't really tell that from these surveys, but I sometimes feel like now this is such a losing battle because you have so many national politicians, let's say, unemployment, so many national politicians blaming the EU for unemployment, right? How do you, I just don't see how you counter that much negativity about the EU, so much political kind of uses of
yeah, so unemployment is actually surprisingly not strongly associated with the EU. Mostly everywhere. Maybe in Cyprus, right? Cyprus is a gross outlier there. Mm-hmm. But so in most countries, fewer than 1 in 5, and so this, most being pretty much sort of almost all the way up to here, fewer than 1 in 5 of the people associate the EU with unemployment. But so it's certainly true that it's hard to fight against the obviously growing tide of sort of populist anti-EU rhetoric, right? However, what I think you'll find if you look more carefully at the contents of the populist EU rhetoric is that it's not the same in every country, right? It is a smart populist, sort of looks into this and says, on what dimensions can I attack the EU that are most going to resonate with my national publics, right? And a smart EU would say, we are going to fight back on those dimensions, right? And so we fight back in sort of a country-specific way, rather than just this sort of overall, all 28 countries, you should think of the EU in this way. I think if you look at Nigel Farage in Britain and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, the things they sort of highlight when they talk about all the bad things the EU does, they talk about different things.
Thank you. So you observe stability across time in the meaning that countries attach to the European Union. So I was wondering, do you have any information whether those meanings remain stable after the accession of Eastern and Central Europe? I mean, before
right.
and after. Was there any change?
Not so much, right? So we don't have an enormous amount of information. I don't have that breakdown on a slide. So this question was first asked in 2002. They asked it 3 times. I think that's either 3 or 4. They asked it 4 times before the East European countries joined. And so there are sort of 4 surveys in the EU 15 where East Europe is not yet part of the European Union, and then there's a whole bunch after. There is no dramatic change or jump among the EU 15 from sort of before 2004 to after 2004. There may be a bit of a shift. The problem is that the shift is hard to completely separate from the fact that there is also the constitutional treaty being negotiated around the same time, right? So those are 2 big events that are happening in the EU world at around the same time. So there is a bit of a shift, not a dramatic one, mind you, there's a bit of a shift, but it's hard to say whether it's because the EU is now much bigger or because the EU is now trying to do a bunch of different things.
When you looked at regions within EU countries, did you notice that certain types of regions tended to cluster together? For example, did more agricultural regions tend to have certain opinions on the EU versus?
No, I did not look specifically. I didn't try to classify regions in ways other than what country are you in and you know, what does the EU mean to you. What would your expectation be about, let's say, agricultural regions?
Maybe a higher opinion of the EU?
Well, yes, but we're not measuring purely higher opinion.
Okay.
We're measuring what you mean to you, right? So,
economic stability or?
So you think agricultural regions are more likely to associate the EU with economic prosperity, maybe? So those are the options, right? What would the expectation be about? So I have thought about this a little bit, right? The question is, I sort of sell this as, here is this really cool question that only asks people what they think, right? It doesn't ask them, what kind of a job are you in? It doesn't ask them, is your country going through a recession? It doesn't ask them, what's your political ideology? It asks them, what does the EU mean to you personally? I think it's really cool that with the answer on just that question, you can basically predict where people are from. Now, it could be that all this is really saying is sort of indirectly getting at some of those things, right? So if you are in an agricultural region, then like everyone in an agricultural region, everyone not in an agricultural region, let's say, thinks the EU is a waste of money because a lot of money goes to agricultural regions, right? And everyone in an agricultural region doesn't think the EU is a waste of money. This is possible, right? But there are sort of, you can come up with a fairly long list of ad hoc possible ways to slice up regions or countries this way. And some of them might work and some might not. I'm a little reluctant to just sort of start spouting ad hoc explanations. I would like more of a theoretical, so, you know, like what's the underlying thing that's driving these answers? And I don't have a very strong theory about precisely which meanings would be associated with agriculture.
I have sort of a specific question about democracy. We've discussed in a lot of our classes sort of issues of democratic legitimacy within the EU, and I'm curious whether you see a relationship between a survey that's kind of measuring public opinion versus actual behavior? Is there any type of correlation between countries that register high or low on democracy and their level of participation in EU democracy or voting for the EP?
So if a lot of people associate the EU with democracy in this question, you would expect that that would be a country with higher turnout in EP elections. That is a good question. I have not looked at that. I could probably look it up, but it would take a minute. My sense is that turnout in EP elections, as is, they're mostly second-order elections, and often is more strongly driven by the domestic political context. So my hypothesis would be no strong correlation, but I don't know whether that is true or not.
And I suppose then to extrapolate, do you see any relationship between how public opinion is being affected by actual on-the-ground policy? For example, economic prosperity. Does it correlate to countries that have either received more funding from the EU or countries that have fared better or worse in the Euro crisis?
Well, so for economic prosperity, we can certainly look.
And I suppose my overarching question would be, if not, why is public opinion not matching up?
Well, so let's start with democracy. So this is democracy, right? Romanians are most likely to associate the EU with democracy. So you could say, oh, well, yeah, that's because their own democracy is so awful, right? But then you run into Denmark, and Denmark is obviously not an awful democracy. So one of the things I mentioned in the paper is that it's actually not so straightforward to come up with a single overarching explanation for the relative ranking of these countries. I don't know if does anyone sort of offhand know EP election turnout figures that would sort of chart against this? I know most East European countries have pretty low turnout. Anyway, so my hypothesis was, at least on this particular dimension, there wouldn't be much correlation. Let's look at the prosperity. There's prosperity. So yeah, so again, like you can say Romania and Bulgaria, very, very poor, got lots of money. So maybe Ireland obviously started very poor, now rich. But then the Netherlands is a net contributor, right? Has been for probably as long as the EU's been around. Denmark is a net contributor. Luxembourg is a net contributor. Slovakia and Lithuania are not the poorest, so they probably don't get a ton of money. So again, it's not an obvious correlation there. I'm sure it's the case that for a few individuals, this link is there, but it's actually surprisingly difficult to tease out national level relations along those lines. Sorry, that's not very...
I have a question about the Eurobarometer in general. Yes. What sort of methods do they use to collect this data, and what measures are in place to ensure that it covers a broad swath of the population?
Good question. So the Eurobarometer is commissioned by the EU, but it's conducted by national surveying organizations. So the EU basically contracts out to national survey organizations, and in most countries, except the very large and the very small, they are basically told get a sample of about 1,000 that is basically stratified on, I think, regional origin and certainly gender and maybe income. So they try to be a little bit representative on those dimensions. I don't know, Milad, most people think that there is all barometer, but representativeness is not. It's not the thing people criticize most often. You can certainly, part of the difficulty with getting regional representation sort of evenly is that you end up with comparatively small regional samples, right? And so sometimes they might not want to do that. My sense is that people have all kinds of concerns about the Eurobarometer, but they're not usually super worried about just how representative these samples are. Often the questions are sort of leading towards a pro-EU answer, and often they are sort of, like, we don't have that slide up anymore, but, like, as I was saying, why pick these random 14 things that might be potential meanings? There's sort of, you often get the sense where someone said, this would be an interesting thing to find out. Let us draw possible answers out of a hat, right? And so, as a scholar, you say, I'm really glad you asked the question, but I would have preferred having some input on what the possible answers were going to be, because, it's better than nothing. Sometimes it's not all that much better than nothing.
So what is the question behind this slide?
So this,
just in terms of I can't find a pattern.
you can't find a pattern. Well, but so that's part of, in a way, that's part of the point, I think. So this slide shows you, over the course of 19 surveys that were held over the course of about a decade, for each of these 27 countries, what was the lowest percentage in a given survey, right, or across surveys, the lowest percentage of the population that said, yes, to me the EU means economic prosperity, and what was the highest and what was the average, right? So on average, Romanians are most likely to associate the EU with economic prosperity, right? And on average, Latvians are least likely to associate the EU with economic prosperity. The vertical range is quite small, right? So you might say, maybe they're likely associated with prosperity in 2004 when they joined the EU and they think they're going to get very rich. And then the big financial crisis comes and they say, oh, geez, we joined and now there's a terrible situation. So that would be a much wider range. In fact, the range is pretty small. So I think what that shows is that this really is measuring something about how people are inclined to sort of think about the EU, and that those ways of thinking are actually they don't follow in any simple, straightforward, direct, fast way from how well is your country doing economically, how well are you doing economically, and so on and so forth. It's that there's like this is a perception rather than a reality in a way.
Or how grateful you should be to be in the EU rather than out of it, right? I mean, those East European countries, if they were out of the EU.
Right, but so in any case, they're not really reacting to any sort of measurable impact of the EU on their economic prosperity. Right. They are for not fully explainable reasons. They are more or less likely to think of the EU in terms of economic prosperity, but it doesn't follow straightforwardly from actual underlying economic realities. But that's part of what I think is so interesting, right? So it's not directly a result of economic reality, but it's also not random, right? You could say it's not directly derived from economic realities. People just sort of randomly think one way or the other. Then you would expect to see a big fluctuation over time. The fact that the fluctuation is actually comparatively narrow says, okay, maybe it's not you're rich or poor, or how grateful are you, or how much has your GDP per capita grown since you joined the EU, but there is something there because year after year in times of boom and bust, people sort of answer within the same fairly narrow band in Latvia, and it's a very different band than the people in the Netherlands.
But in a way, this survey only covers 10 years.
Yes.
And people might need additional time in order to process the information they observe empirically and to actually form ideas. So I was wondering, the long-term
You think people are that
states,
slow?
Well, I think that some people might acquire more information to be able to judge for ideas, or they, in the course of their lifetime, they might become more informed about economics, maybe in this particular question. But I was wondering, so we observe France and Germany, and they're kind of pretty to the right. So do you think that at the beginning of the integration process, they might have been more to the right?
What would
right
this
now
look like if you asked the same question in 1975?
Yeah, because right now they contribute a big portion of the EU budget, but in the past they might have benefited more, so their perceptions might have been different.
True. But we did also just point out that the Netherlands, which is a per capita larger contributor than Germany, is over on the left.
It's a small economy and it benefits from trade. So I just wonder, because
Why
Ireland,
should you expect Germany to be over here now and not the Netherlands?
because right now the perception is that Germany is kind of sustaining Europe in terms of its contributions, and maybe it's not getting as much in return.
Okay, so the argument would be the Germans think that they are paying too much and the Dutch don't.
Probably. And maybe relative to what they're getting out of the EU.
Okay, right. So I suppose that's possible, right? And so then it would be not think so 20 years ago, and they would have been different. I suppose it's possible, right? It's unfortunately not easy to test because this particular question, which allows us to make these comparisons across countries and over time, was not asked prior to 2002. But certainly, and I've started looking at, like, are there vaguely comparable national surveys where you could try and get at that a little bit. You could try and see whether there have been, if you look over, say, 20 or 30 years rather than just 10, whether there have been sort of real shifts. My guess is not so much, actually.
Yeah, I realize that you're constrained by data. I was just wondering whether you think that long-term member states might have shown greater variation.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. The thing that leads me to suspect that there would be less big shifting than one might fear is these kinds of patterns where, like, the Netherlands is there and Germany is there. The kinds of mechanisms that would lead, Germany over time to shift from left to right ought, by most accounts, to apply just as well to the Netherlands, right? And they don't seem to have, which suggests to me that maybe this is not going on. But it would be, I completely agree that it would actually be incredibly interesting to be able to go further back in time. And like I said, I'm sort of trying to get a little bit in that direction by looking at vaguely comparable surveys. But comparability across surveys is difficult when the questions are different and the answers are different.
I was wondering, was there, maybe this answers the question, if there was like a survey or a question that asks, that lets us know how aware is the population of the certain country, and how well educated is it about the EU? Because a lot of times maybe this is a problem of communication between the EU, because a lot of people, like, there are surveys that show that a lot of people feel like they're distanced from the EU. They don't really know what's going on. So this perception might change if like the specific national government was more active into educating their people about the EU and what it's really doing. Because a lot of people, if you ask them, like, what are the institutions in the EU, or who are the members of the parliament, they won't really know. So this is very skewed on,
Well, yes and no, right? So, yes, the EU is sort of distant or arguably not even present for many of these people. However, if it really means that, like, they don't know anything about the EU and so on and so forth, then when they get asked this question, you would expect them to pull answers out of a hat, right? So you would expect to see a lot of variation both within a country, get 1,000 people randomly pulling answers out of a hat, and over time, right? The next time you pull your answer out of a hat, you get a different answer. And you don't see either, right? You see relatively narrow margin within a country over time. And if you break down the country into small groups, people tend to answer the same way, right? So if people really had no idea and they were randomly answering, then if I picked 20 people here and 20 people there from the same country, I would not expect them to come up with the same answers. But they seem to, right? So they may not know, and I think you're correct, that most EU citizens know very little factually about, what the EU does and what the institutions are and so on and so forth. But I think what this evidence fairly strongly suggests is that most Europeans do have some kind of an image in their head about the EU. And that image is not the same, right? That image varies from country to country. That's basically what I think this data shows. Yeah. I don't know where the microphone, someone behind you is.
I'm still wondering how you can conclude out of these data to certain cultural patterns. I would say that, for example, Estonia and Latvia, they got a very strong public opinion on NATO. NATO is very present because of the air policing by German aircrafts, and so if they are asked how important is economic prosperity, and it's pretty low rates for approval, that does not necessarily mean from the data that they don't approve or acknowledge it, but that there's a different topic which is just overlapping and which is more important. And so I'm still not entirely sure how you can kind of select from these data and can apply them to a certain cultural pattern. For example, if a typical, from my personal opinion, if a typical German is asked, is the EU good for German economy? The first which would come up in my mind is not the question itself, but what could be more important, because it's so deeply embedded in culture that the peace and cooperation aspect is so important that maybe economy is not the first thing which comes up in my mind. So
right, but so, okay, I think very good point. So, on the last part of your point, people are asked, all 14 of them, right? So even if it doesn't come up in your mind, you will get asked as a respondent, so what does the EU mean to you? And you say, the surveyor says peace, and you say yes, obviously. And you might not have thought about economic prosperity, but that's going to be on the list at some point, right? And so I don't think the story you're telling suggests that you would then refuse to say yes because you had not thought of it immediately. You would still say yes, right? Now, it is true, I think you're right, that the fact that people don't associate the EU with economic prosperity is not quite the same as them not thinking the EU has not brought them any, right? But that was sort of what I was talking about with Milada about, in the sense that if you ask someone, has the EU brought you economic prosperity, you might actually get a different answer than, when you think about the EU, do you think about economic prosperity? That, I think, it's correct that those might be different. How different, I don't really know. But the fact that they have this image where economic prosperity isn't very prominent, and that the image is relatively stable over time, is interesting in and of itself, I think, right? And it is interesting for the kinds of things that Milada's earlier question was about, right? If you want people to like the EU, if you're the EU and you want people to sort of, support you and turn up at elections, then you want to affect the image, not the, in the sort of more rational asking you, so has the EU done anything for prosperity? Thank you.